Let's talk about the absolutely wild story of Samuel Zemurray. This is a guy who showed up in America with literally nothing and somehow ended up taking on one of the most powerful corporations on the entire planet. It's a story all about ambition, power, and, you guessed it, bananas. Okay, so just picture it. The year is 1933. You're in a stuffy Boston boardroom surrounded by all these powerful suit-wearing directors of the United Fruit Company. And then this guy, this outsider you've kind of laughed at for years, he just storms in and says that. That man was Samuel Zemurray. And you know what? He wasn't asking for permission. He was telling them how it was going to be. And this is really the whole story right here. It's a classic David and Goliath, or in this case, the fish and the whale. On one side, you have the fish, Sam Zemurray. He's this scrappy, penniless immigrant who's all hustle. And on the other side, you've got the whale, the United Fruit Company, a corporate monster so huge they called it the octopus because its tentacles were wrapped all over Central America.
So you have to be asking, how on earth does that happen? How does the little fish swallow the giant whale? Well, that crazy boardroom scene in 1933, that wasn't the start of the story. Oh no, that was the explosive finale to a fight that had been brewing for decades.
You see, the whole thing was made possible by the Great Depression. The United Fruit Company, this corporation that everyone thought was completely untouchable, was suddenly on its knees. The global economy had collapsed, their business model was in shambles, and for the first time, they were vulnerable. And Zemurray, he could smell blood in the water.
And I mean, look at these numbers. The drop-off is just staggering. Profits went from $45 million all the way down to just $6 million in only 4 years. Now for Zemurray, this was personal. He had sold his own company to United Fruit, but he took his payment in stock. So when their ship was sinking, it was taking his entire fortune down with it. He had no choice but to act. But wait a second. How did this guy, this immigrant who started with nothing, even get a seat at that table? How did he become a major shareholder in the first place? Well, it all started with something that everybody else was literally throwing away. And that brings us to this brilliant idea. Ripes. So ripes were the bananas that were just a little too ripe for the big companies to ship far inland. They were about to go bad. To United Fruit, it was actual garbage. They would just dump them in the harbor. But to Sam Zemurray, he saw gold.
And his whole system was just pure genius, so simple, so fast. He'd buy these ripes for pennies, right? He'd throw them on a train car, and then, and this is the clever part, he'd run to the telegraph office and wire ahead to all the little grocery stores in the towns down the line. He'd sell the entire train car of bananas before he even got there. It was a frantic race against the clock, and he was the undisputed champion.
And the results were just explosive. I mean, in a handful of years, he went from selling maybe 20,000 bananas to over 500,000. He wasn't just some guy hustling on the docks anymore. He was becoming a force, known up and down the Mississippi River as Sam the Banana Man.
But you know, selling other people's leftovers, that was never going to be enough for a guy like Sam. To get really big, he knew he had to control the whole operation, from the seed to the store. And that meant he had to go to the source, the jungles of Central America.
And here's what set him apart. Unlike those executives up in Boston, Sam got his hands dirty. He actually moved to Honduras, lived in the jungle, learned Spanish, and got to know the locals. He bought up all this swampland that nobody else wanted, and, this is key, he got the Honduran government to give him huge tax breaks. And just like that, he built his very own empire from the mud up, the Cayamel Fruit Company.
So this is where it gets really interesting. The Honduran government, with a lot of pressure from Wall Street and the U.S. State Department, basically made a deal that was going to cancel all of Zemurray's land deals and tax breaks. It would have completely wiped him out overnight. So, what would you do?
Well, what Sam Zemurray did is just, it sounds like something out of a movie, seriously. He walked into a bar in New Orleans, hired a couple of famous mercenaries, put together a small army, bought an old U.S. Navy warship, and then he launched his own private invasion of Honduras, a full-on coup funded by one guy who sold bananas. And the craziest part? It actually worked. The old government was out, Zemurray's hand-picked guy was in, and wouldn't you know it, one of the first things the new president did was grant Sam the Banana Man every single tax break and land deal he wanted. He had locked in his power for decades.
This was a game changer. After this move, Zemurray was no longer just some small-time annoyance to the whale, to United Fruit. He was a real rival, and the stage was now set for an all-out war over who would control the banana trade.
And you can really boil this whole conflict down to these two guys. You had Victor Cutter, the polished Ivy League-educated president of United Fruit, running things from a skyscraper in Boston. And then you had Sam Zemurray, living in a little bungalow in the jungle, speaking Spanish with his workers, knowing every single detail of the business. It was a total clash of worlds. You know, the funny thing is, the leadership at United Fruit was just so arrogant about it. They totally underestimated him. To them, he was just that little fellow in Honduras, some uncultured nobody. They just couldn't see the threat that was growing right under their noses.
But Zemurray? Oh, he knew exactly what kind of fight he was in. And his response says it all. It just perfectly captures that relentless, all-or-nothing way he approached everything. He was not going to back down. He was going to win or die trying.
And as we already know, he won. He took over United Fruit and he ran it for 20 years. But this is where the story and the man gets a lot more complicated. Because the very methods that made him so successful, they left behind a really dark and controversial legacy.
You see, decades after his first coup, he basically ran the same play again. Only this time, he didn't need to hire his own army. In 1954, the democratically elected government in Guatemala threatened to take back some of United Fruit's land. So, the company used its incredible political influence in Washington, D.C., convincing the CIA that the Guatemalan leader was a communist. The result was a CIA-backed coup called Operation Success. They overthrew a democracy, and the country was thrown into a brutal civil war that lasted for decades.
So in the end, you just can't paint this guy with one brush. On the one hand, he's the ultimate immigrant success story, a true business innovator, and he gave away millions to charity. But on the other hand, he's an exploiter who literally overthrew governments for profit. He's both of these things at the exact same time.
And you know, maybe Zemurray himself got it. Late in his life, he actually admitted to feeling guilty. It's a pretty stunning confession from a guy who, for his entire life, was the picture of pure, unapologetic power.
And that really leaves us with the big question of his entire life. I mean, his story is, without a doubt, the American dream. He went from rags to unimaginable riches. But it really forces you to stop and ask, what is the true price of that dream? And who is the one that ultimately has to pay it?